The question of, am I afraid to die, is something I actually live with every day.
I think everybody's afraid to die. The question is, how do you deal with the fear?
I like being alive. I like this incarnation, you know, I'm attached to it.
If I weren't afraid to die, I would not be taking it seriously. I mean, in some ways, I think death is the most important experience that you're preparing for all your life.
Why is it so important to talk about death? It's the unspoken phobia of the culture. You can see it if you look at the major issues like abortion, death penalty, euthanasia, terrorism. It all concerns this issue of death.
When I discovered I was dying, and I knew I was going to die actively and creatively, I called Ram Dass because I knew he would understand.
Like that.
See that? That's a gallery of some book I wrote years ago. He's a wise friend and a loving, protective friend over many years and many experiences.
Tim and I, in 1963 with Ralph, were doing the psychedelic experience, which was a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And that led to a pretty deep study of psychedelics, and since we were both dealing with what we considered was psychological death and rebirth, and we had been through those death-rebirth experiences many times together, it's reasonable for him to think of me as somebody who would understand what this death experience was going to be like for him.
The psychedelic experience was the first modern book to provide a map for mind-expanding drug sessions, much as the Tibetan Book of the Dead provided advice for traveling through after-death states known to Tibetan Buddhists as bardos.
Bardo actually means in between. This is a bardo too. We are in the bardo of life. They were talking about the bardo connected to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the bardo between death and rebirth. And they identified LSD as a vehicle to pre-experience what that would be like.
Long before I knew I was dying, we were using this metaphor of leaving your body, leaving your mind, and contacting a different level of altered states, expanded consciousness. So my life has prepared me for this.
I've seen so many people die clinging to the past and also worried about the future. I think this is the moment. That's what I got, is this moment. And one of these moments, I'll be dead. And that'll be the moment.
In 1977, Ram Dass founded the Dying Project with Stephen and Andre Levine and Dale Borglum. He's been a kind of midwife to the dying since 1963, offering wisdom, compassion, and his knowledge of other planes of consciousness.
Ram Dass was the pioneer. He's the person who really opened up that field for me personally.
The amount of cost in keeping people alive, forget quality of life now, just physically alive, the intensive care unit strategy was finally prohibitive. It was getting prohibitive. It was just eating up all the resources. Then comes the hospice movement, which says, oh, well, what we've missed is that the psychological part of dying is also important. And hospice is much cheaper than intensive care unit. Well, all it requires is that we accept the fact that death exists. And that's a big shift, to accept death existing versus it's a failure and an enemy.